Good evening, everyone. I am Amanda Benton, an Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Marist and a graduate from the class of 2011. Very excited to share the Charlotte Cunneen-Hackett lecture with you today in conjunction with the Hudson River Valley Institute. Due to the number of participants, we have muted all of the lines except for the hosts and the panelists. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and Kevin will address them at the end of the presentation. You can use the chat option for any technical questions you have or general questions for the Marist staff who are listening. Please do not send private messages to our presenter as he may not see them. And now I'd like to introduce Tom Wormuth, who will welcome today's presenter. Tom is the Vice President for Academic Affairs at Marist and Director of the Hudson River Valley Institute. He is also a graduate of Marist. Tom, thank you for spending time with us this evening, and I'm handing it over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Amanda, and good evening, everyone. I am Tom Wormuth, as Amanda pointed out. I'm Vice President for Academics here at Marist College, and I'm Director of the Hudson River Valley Institute. I want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone here tonight to the 2022 Cunneen-Hackett Lecture in Hudson River Valley History, and a special thanks to the Marist Alumni Office for hosting this event this evening. Now, the Charlotte Cunneen-Hackett Lecture Series was established in 2001, over 20 years ago, to advance appreciation of the rich heritage of the Hudson River Valley and promote history of the region. It has now been a major part of major lecture for the Hudson River Valley for over 20 years. I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge several members of the Hudson River Valley Institute Advisory Board who are with us here tonight. Our chair, Alex Reese, Kevin Burke, Eileen Cook, Mary Etta Schneider, Shirley Handel, Alan Miller, Denise Van Buren, who is President General of the DAR. A special welcome, and Tom McHenry, son of Barnabas McHenry. Special welcome to the Marist trustees in attendance, Stephen Efron, John O'Shea, and also a special welcome to the official state historian of New York, Devin Lander, the New York State historian. Also, I'd like to welcome the members of the Long Reach Society, which provides enrichment opportunities to Marist students who demonstrate exceptional achievement in the humanities. Now, this evening, I have the distinct honor to announce the establishment of the Dr. James M. and Lois S. Johnson Student Research Fund. The purpose of this endowed fund is to provide enrichment opportunities that enable student interns at the Hudson River Valley Institute to undertake more impactful experiences and develop more in-depth projects by providing access to monetary support for necessary expenses. The Johnson Student Research Fund will allow students from a variety of economic backgrounds to have equal access to the enrichment potential that comes from a fully realized internship experience with HRVI. As some of you may know, Jim has stepped down as Executive Director of HRVI and will be completing a phased retirement at the end of August. We want to thank Jim for his many years of service and vision and invite you to join us in supporting the Johnson Student Research Fund by making a gift at the hudsonrivervalley.org/Johnson. The link will be shared during the chat. I will now hand it over to Jim to introduce tonight's featured speaker. Jim?
Thank you, Tom. Lois and I are honored to have this fund established in our names. I've told every new entering group of interns that they're the lifeblood of the Hudson River Valley Institute. And so this will help us perpetuate that and will be an important legacy of two individuals who spent a great deal of our careers teaching. So there could not be a better honor to establish my legacy, Lois's legacy, as we move the Institute into the future. I'm honored tonight as my last official duty for the Cunneen-Hackett Lecture Series to introduce a former student, a cadet, and colleague in the West Point History Department, Colonel retired Kevin Weddle. Teachers' legacies are embodied in the successes of their former students. Kevin epitomizes success for me as a teacher. In my performance review of Cadet Weddle in 1978, then Captain Johnson wrote that Kevin was a superior student who is interested in military history, is interesting to talk with, and a pleasure to teach. He is a superior cadet and will make an outstanding officer. I subsequently recommended him for graduate school and to be an instructor in the Department of History, which he did. So now I'd give you the proof of my spot-on assessment of Kevin's abilities and potential as an officer and an academic. Kevin is the professor of military theory and strategy and Elihu Root Chair of Military Studies at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's a graduate of West Point, class of 1979, and served for 28 years as a combat engineer officer. Throughout his career, he worked in a variety of command and staff positions in the United States and overseas, and is a veteran of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm and Operation Enduring Freedom. Colonel Weddle holds master's degrees in history and civil engineering from the University of Minnesota and a Ph.D. in history from Princeton University. Because he was a Corps of Engineers officer, his branch required that he get an engineering degree at the same time that he got his master's in history. He's the author of Lincoln's Tragic Admiral, The Life of Samuel Francis DuPont. That was a University of Virginia Press publication, has written numerous articles for popular and scholarly journals, and appeared as an on-air expert in the 2020 History Channel documentary, Washington. This evening, Dr. Weddle will present research from his recently published book, The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, Oxford University Press. This assesses the campaign from the tactical, operational, strategic, and leadership perspectives. The book just received, Kevin found out, the 2022 very prestigious Francis Tavern Museum Book Award. The book is given the award is given to someone who has produced a book that is the best published work on the American Revolutionary War, combining original scholarship, insight, and good writing. And when you buy the book and read it, you will see that it lives up to exactly those words. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce one of my star students, my friend, Dr. Kevin Weddle.
Jim, thank you very much for that very overly generous introduction. It's a real honor to be with everyone this evening, and I'm humbled and grateful to be part of this wonderful lecture series. And on a personal note, I am especially thrilled to play a small role in honoring Jim Johnson tonight. Jim, always a modest guy, but he's a great scholar, leader, and for me, especially as a young cadet and a young captain in the Army, he's a great role model and mentor. So congratulations, Jim, on your retirement and this great honor that you've just been bestowed. So tonight we're going to discuss one of the most pivotal military campaigns in American history. The Saratoga campaign included 10 battles and engagements. It lasted almost 5 months. And this campaign was complex, it was fluid, it was multidimensional, it was shaped by countless interactions and contingencies that played out over hundreds of square miles. And the personalities involved were as fascinating as any you're ever going to encounter. But more important than all that, it changed the very character of the American Revolution. Now, my new book on Saratoga that Jim showed you examines the campaign and all of its political, strategic, and military complexity, and it dissects the strategy, the decision-making, and the leadership of all the key players on both sides. So in the short time we have this evening, I'm going to quickly cover the conduct of the campaign, and then I want to zero in on just a couple of the key interpretations from my book. So obviously I can't hit all the highlights from the campaign, but hopefully we can fill in some of the gaps during the Q&A. So in late August 1777, Britain's King George III received momentous news. And the great tidings, so thrilled the monarch of Great Britain that he burst into his wife's chambers, waving the message in the air and exclaiming, "I have beat them, I have beat the Americans." Now, he had just learned that British Lieutenant General John Burgoyne and his army had captured the strategically vital American fortress of Fort Ticonderoga, which sat astride the great Lake Champlain Hudson River invasion route from Canada. Now, this victory, achieved with almost no casualties, convinced the king and his ministers that the military strategy that they had put into place the preceding spring to end the American Revolution was going according to plan. But less than 2 months after the king's impromptu celebration, Burgoyne and his army met with an unprecedented disaster, and the British were subsequently faced with a very, very different war. So how did this come about, and what were the implications of this defeat? So it's important to understand the strategic situation in early 1777. Now, I know many of you are experts in the American Revolution, but just to review, in early 1777, the British occupied New York City. George Washington and his army had barely escaped destruction. To many, it seemed as if the revolution was on its last legs, but then Washington stopped the bleeding with his stunning twin victories at Trenton and Princeton in late 1776 and early 1777. So now the British were faced with a problem. After Trenton and Princeton, they realized that a new British plan for 1777 was needed. And so they planned military operations that included what would become the Saratoga campaign. So more on those plans later. So now I'd like to review the conduct of the Saratoga campaign. So British Lieutenant General John Burgoyne and his over 10,000 man army departed from Canada on the 14th of June, 1777, and they arrived at Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. Their objective was to take the fort and continue south to the Hudson River all the way to Albany. A supporting force of about 1,800 men, commanded by Brigadier General Barry St. Leger, left Canada on the 23rd of June. Now, their mission was to travel down the Mohawk River Valley to meet Burgoyne at Albany. So they arrived at the Mohawk River about on the 2nd of August. Now, while this was happening, General Sir William Howe, the British commander-in-chief in North America, set sail with his main British army in New York City on the 23rd of July, bound for Philadelphia. Due to contrary winds, they didn't land. They weren't able to land south of the city until the 25th of August. So we'll talk about their overall strategic objectives in a few minutes. Now, the main American army in New Jersey was commanded by General George Washington, and the American Northern Army was commanded by Major General Philip Schuyler. So here you can see the comparison of the forces at the beginning of the campaign. The American Northern Army has about 7,000 against Burgoyne's about 10,500 troops. Now, Major General Philip Schuyler there on the left, he was commander of the American Northern Department, which included Fort Ticonderoga and the Northern Army. He's a native New Yorker. He lives in the Saratoga area. He's an upper class patrician, and he comes across as a bit haughty. He's not particularly well liked by the troops, and especially militia troops and New Englanders. Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, the Brit, was a career British cavalry officer. He was known to be very aggressive and flamboyant, sometimes arrogant and pompous, but he was also very well liked by his troops, not a common occurrence in the professional British Army there in the 18th century. He served in America early in the Revolution, but he didn't have much respect for Americans or American soldiers, and this was magnified after his easy capture of Ticonderoga. He's also a playwright. He's a member of Parliament. He's a favorite of King George III. But despite serving almost his entire adult life in the British Army, this was his first real independent command. So Burgoyne's first step was to take Fort Ticonderoga, which he assumed would be the toughest part of his campaign. Now, as I already mentioned, Burgoyne and his army arrived at Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. Through some skillful maneuvering, Burgoyne was able to convince the fort's American commander, that's Major General Arthur Sinclair there on the left, that his position was hopeless. Burgoyne outnumbered the Americans about 2-1. And Sinclair ordered the evacuation of the fort on the 5th of July after offering almost no resistance. Now, in the book, I'm pretty critical of General Sinclair's leadership. So in a matter of days, Burgoyne had taken possession of this great fortress of Ticonderoga that guarded those approaches to the lower part of the Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley. Now, it's impossible to overstate the negative impact on the Americans caused by the loss of Fort Ticonderoga. George Washington, Congress, and nearby state governments were absolutely appalled that Sinclair and Schuyler had allowed this to happen. They had been led to believe that the fort was almost impregnable. This easy victory also fed Burgoyne's overconfidence and hubris, since he had initially believed that taking Ticonderoga would be very difficult. In the meantime, the loss of Ticonderoga unnerved Major General Philip Schuyler, the American commander of the Northern Department. So we've talked about Burgoyne's easy capture of Fort Ticonderoga. Now let's take a look at the supporting column that was supposed to go down the Mohawk River Valley and meet Burgoyne at Albany. So Barry St. Leger departed Canada on the 23rd of July. And as he approached the Mohawk River, he encountered Fort Stanwix, thought to be in ruins by the British, but instead manned by a plucky American garrison. St. Leger had to neutralize that fort before he could proceed down the Mohawk River Valley. So on the 2nd of August, he began a siege. Now, the Americans were outnumbered here about 3-1, worse odds than those faced by the Americans at Ticonderoga. So things did not look particularly good. On the 6th of August, not long after the British began their siege of Fort Stanwix, an American militia relief force was ambushed on their way to the fort and almost destroyed by a detachment sent by St. Leger, composed in large part of Native Americans. The fighting during this Battle of Oriskany was horrific, and both sides suffered heavy casualties, which led to the mass desertion of most of St. Leger's Indian allies. The Stanwix garrison, under the inspired leadership of their commander, Colonel Peter Gansevoort, held out for 22 days. The Americans resisted all efforts by St. Leger to either take the fort or force it to surrender. So the contrast between the leadership of Gansevoort at Fort Stanwix and Sinclair at Ticonderoga could not be more stark. 2 weeks after Oriskany, Major General Benedict Arnold led a detachment of the Northern Army up the Mohawk to relieve the Stanwix garrison. Now, by that time, most of his Indians had deserted, so St. Leger realized that his mission had failed, and so he gathered his remaining men and he returned to Canada in late August. And there you can see that on the map. Arnold marched to Stanwix, made sure the fort was no longer at risk, and then he quickly returned to the main army north of Albany. The siege of Stanwix is one of the most inspiring stories of the entire campaign, and it was really the first good news for the Americans in a long time. And if I had to, pick my favorite part of the book, I think it was the whole Fort Stanwix area, the Fort Stanwix saga. I found that really interesting. So now we're going to zero in on this area of the map, that red box, because that's where the rest of the campaign is going to play out. So the chronology is not exactly in sync, because a lot of the things that are happening at Stanwix is happening while this part of the campaign was going on. So as I mentioned earlier, Burgoyne seized Fort Ticonderoga almost without a fight on the 6th of July. He left a large garrison at Fort Ticonderoga to guard his supply route back to Canada. The American garrison marched overland to the east, closely pursued by the British. The American rear guard was caught and engaged on the 7th of July at the small but important Battle of Hubbardton. The Brits won, but they were forced to end their pursuit. Burgoyne also caught and scattered other escaping, retreating Americans at Skenesboro at the southern tip of Lake Champlain, also today, present-day Whitehall, New York. After losing Ticonderoga, Schuyler concentrated the army at Fort Edward. There you can see them in blue, that insignia there in blue. Now, so Burgoyne moved the bulk of his army to Skenesboro, where he stayed for 2 weeks. He then moved to Fort Stanwix, Fort Edward, where he stayed for another 2 weeks. The American army withdrew in the face of Burgoyne's advance, but as they did, they obstructed the British route, slowing their rate of march. Now, Schuyler does a good job delaying Burgoyne and rebuilding the shattered Northern Army, but there was little indication of that in his panicky and pessimistic messages back to his superiors, Washington and Congress. But by trading space for time, the Americans were able to regroup after the Ticonderoga disaster, as Burgoyne began to run into serious logistical issues because he had left Canada without sufficient supplies and transport. By the time Burgoyne arrived at Fort Miller, he was in deep trouble logistically. And this forced him to stay at Fort Miller for another 3 weeks. Now, in early August, Congress had had enough, and they relieved Major General Philip Schuyler and replaced him with Major General Horatio Gates. And there you see his picture there. Now, Gates was a former British Army officer. He served in the French and Indian War in North America. He married an American girl, settled down in the colonies, and he quickly became Americanized. So when the revolution began, he offers his services to the Continental Army, and he serves under Washington. He's a good manager. He understands logistics. He believes in defensive warfare. He also understands how best to employ American militia forces. He desperately wants an independent command. And although Gates and Washington enjoy a good relationship early in the war, it had really deteriorated by 1777. Now, by mid-August, Burgoyne's logistical situation was extremely dire. So he sent a large detachment of primarily German troops to seize food and transport known to be at Bennington, Vermont. So there you can see them moving out toward Bennington. Now, they were intercepted and destroyed by an American force of mostly militia commanded by Brigadier General John Stark at the Battle of Bennington on the 16th of August. Now Burgoyne is in deep, deep trouble. He's just lost 1,000 men, and almost all of his Native American allies deserted after Bennington. In the meantime, Gates will move his army north and then he'll dig in on favorable terrain at a place called Bemis Heights. Burgoyne decides to continue on to Albany, and on the 13th of September, he crossed the Hudson to the west bank and he continued south. The two evenly matched armies finally fought a full-scale battle on the 19th of September, 1777, called the Battle of Freeman's Farm. And although the British suffered casualties that amounted to 3 times the American losses, the Brits held their ground, and thus they could claim a nominal victory. So now Burgoyne is faced with yet another big decision. He's faced with decision after decision throughout this whole campaign, and I talk about those decisions at length in my book. So now his decision is, do I push on to Albany or do I fall back? He directed his army to prepare defensive positions and dig in. So that's what they do. As Burgoyne's army grew weaker due to sickness, battle casualties, and desertions, the American army grew stronger as hundreds and thousands of militia forces flocked to Bemis Heights. As Burgoyne pondered his options, none of them very good, Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton will throw him a lifeline. So Clinton is Howe's second in command, and that's his picture there. He had been left behind in New York City after Howe took the rest of the army to Philadelphia. His instructions are to hold the city and, if possible, to help Burgoyne. By the time of the first Battle of Saratoga, that Battle of Freeman's Farm that we just talked about, the last message Clinton had received from Burgoyne was dated the 6th of August, which stated that message stated that everything was going great. But then on the 21st of September, he received a shocking note for Burgoyne that, in fact, things were now going very, very badly. Clinton replied that he'll try to move up the Hudson in an attempt to draw Gates off his friend Burgoyne. Now, it takes Clinton a while to get everything ready to go, but he starts his move north on the 3rd of October with 3,000 men on transport vessels accompanied by 3 Royal Navy warships. Shortly after Clinton departed, he received a note from Burgoyne stated that now he was down to only about 5,000 men facing 10,000 Americans. So this just added to the sense of urgency. For Clinton's mission to have any chance of success, he had to get past 2 American forts, Fort Clinton and Fort Montgomery, and river obstacles that guarded access to the Hudson River Valley in the Hudson Highlands. Now, these forts were located just south of West Point on the west bank of the river. He had to capture or neutralize these 2 forts in order for him to be able to continue up the river. So he decided to land his soldiers well south of the forts, march overland, and conduct direct assaults against both enemy positions. So after a feint against American positions on the east bank, the troops landed. Clinton split his forces, sending 900 against Fort Montgomery and 1,200 against Fort Clinton. And there you can see what he did there, with the goal of a simultaneous attack on both forts. So he achieves his goal. He's able to conduct almost simultaneous attacks on these forts. And after short, sharp fights, he's able to capture both forts with fairly heavy casualties on both sides of the ledger. Now, after Clinton made short work of Forts Montgomery and Clinton, his soldiers and sailors dismantled the chain blocking the river that the Patriots had erected at the base of Fort Montgomery. It was a trivial task once the covering batteries had been captured. Now note, this is a year before the Great Chain, which most of us are very familiar with, was built at West Point. The Hudson River now was open. Clinton ordered Major General John Vaughn to continue north with the goal of assisting Burgoyne. Vaughn advanced to Esopus, present-day Kingston, New York, where he put the town to the torch, and then he continued north, trying desperately to contact Burgoyne with the goal of relieving him, or at least to help supply him from the south, or force Gates to send troops to face him. But there were just too many American militia and Continentals between Vaughn's force and Burgoyne, and so the British relief expedition was forced to turn back after advancing as far as Livingston's Manor. So Burgoyne, in the meantime, was forced to cut rations twice as he waited in vain for Clinton to arrive. But it was not to be. The closest the British relief expedition reached was still about 70 miles short of Burgoyne. Now, this is a photo I took a few years ago from Bemis Heights looking north. This is where the American positions were. It's also in the book. As you can see from this image, the American position commanded both the Hudson River and the road to Albany, which is why Gates was determined to hold this formidable piece of terrain. Now, while Clinton's futile rescue attempt was playing out, there was also a lot of drama on the American side. Gates and his second in command, Benedict Arnold, who had commanded the American left wing during the Battle of Freeman's Farm, had a bitter quarrel over credit for the 19 September battle and over what to do next. For almost 2 weeks, the two generals engaged in a nasty and petty war of letters, even though their headquarters were only about a half-mile apart. But contrary to the standard account of Saratoga, by the time the Second Battle of Saratoga took place, they were once again able to work together, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. By this point, Gates's army probably numbered about 11,000. He enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority as militia forces poured in day and night. Still, I think, as we all know, the battle doesn't always go to the strongest, so Burgoyne still has a chance. I mean, you always still have a chance. But Burgoyne, I think, made a fatal error when he didn't press his advantage right after the first battle or retreating back north as he waited for Clinton to get closer. So at this point, time was definitely on the American side. So finally, Burgoyne, desperate for food for his men and animals, decided to personally lead a 1,700-man reconnaissance force out of their fortifications with a twofold mission. First, most importantly, find forage for food and fodder for his men and animals. Second, to see if maybe it was possible to still get around Gates's army and make a dash for Albany and there to spend a winter and or meet up with Clinton. So it was a desperate attempt, and although Burgoyne didn't know it, of course, Clinton had already turned back. So really quickly, I want to go through this Second Battle of Saratoga. Mid-morning on the 7th of October, Burgoyne personally led this ad hoc 1,700-man reconnaissance force out of their positions into trying to find some food. So things start out really well when, after a short march, they encounter an unharvested field of wheat. Burgoyne immediately ordered his men to start collecting the precious food. The Americans soon spotted this movement, and the battle begins. Now, this is where one of several places where I diverge from the standard account of Saratoga. The standard account, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, holds that Gates had relieved Arnold of his command of the Army's left wing due to their quarrel after Freeman's Farm, and that when Arnold heard firing as the battle opened on the 7th of October, he rushed out to the front American lines without orders and on his own initiative, took charge, won the battle as the cowardly Gates cowered in his tent. Now, it's a great story, it's very dramatic, and it puts Gates in the worst possible light, but it's simply not true. And this is what I think really happened. So when Gates learned of Burgoyne's movement out of his fortifications, he ordered Arnold to send out Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen to meet them. And then shortly thereafter, he sent another brigade. These American units were soon inflicting heavy casualties on Burgoyne's force. So in the face of this strong attack, Burgoyne tried to conduct an orderly retreat, but an aide was shot down trying to deliver the message. Soon the Brits' line started to break. Arnold sees an opportunity and he rides back to the US positions on Bemis Heights and he begs Gates to give him more troops. According to a reliable eyewitness, Arnold said to Gates, "It's late in the day, but let me have men and we will have some fun with them before sunset." Gates agreed, and he sent out another brigade and elements of still another brigade under Arnold's direction to attack Burgoyne from the south. So there you can see this attack. So as the British flanks crumbled because of those initial flank attacks, Arnold and the new brigade hit the German force, primarily German forces in the center. The Germans hold out bravely against this determined American attack. British Brigadier General Simon Fraser, probably Burgoyne's best combat commander, was mortally wounded, trying to get his men back in good order. The British right dissolved and the Germans were left isolated, and so they had to fall back. Soon Burgoyne's entire reconnaissance force broke apart and the troops streamed back into their fortifications. Most of the Brits survivors fled into the closer light infantry redoubt with a much smaller number into Bremen's fortified camp just to the northwest of that. The Americans hit the light infantry redoubt hard, but they couldn't penetrate the fortifications. Arnold spotted a weakness in the enemy defenses and he turned his attention to the German camp as the sun began to set. Arnold personally led his men into Bremen's fortified camp, quickly overrunning it. Arnold himself was seriously wounded in the attack. The American capture of this key position on Burgoyne's right flank is really a fatal blow. The British army was now outflanked. As night fell and with the Americans firmly established on his right, Burgoyne was forced to order his army to fall back. At the end of this second bloody battle, the Americans are firmly positioned on Burgoyne's right flank, finally forcing Burgoyne to pull out and retreat north. Burgoyne's exhausted army trudged north in a cold driving rain, but their retreat ground to a halt after only 8 miles at a place called Saratoga, where the Americans followed closely behind. There at Saratoga, the heavily outnumbered British were soon surrounded. It was over. After several tense days of negotiations, terms were agreed to on the 16th of October. Burgoyne had left Canada with over 10,000 men, and only 15 weeks after seizing the great fortress at Ticonderoga, he ended up surrendering almost 6,000 soldiers. On the 17th of October, while an American band played Yankee Doodle, Burgoyne surrendered his army to Gates, as depicted in this famous Trumbull painting now hanging in the US Capitol Rotunda. So there's lots of strategic implications. I talk about them at length in the book. I'm just going to talk about just a couple of them here. So there were 2 large British field armies in North America. They've just lost one of them. Of course, American morale soars, British morale down. Opposition in Parliament now becomes emboldened and it gains support. There wasn't anti-war opposition in the British Parliament. Saratoga totally upstages Howe's capture of Philadelphia, which occurs simultaneously with the Saratoga campaign. The Brits are desperate after Saratoga, and in fact, they even offer Americans very favorable terms, almost what we would think of today as Commonwealth status. But after Saratoga, the Americans turned them down cold. The long-term implications are even more important. 2 days after the French learn of the victory on the 4th of December, Louis XVI, he's there on the right, directed that negotiations be reopened with the American diplomatic delegation that would lead to an alliance with the US. Saratoga offered the opening that Benjamin Franklin's diplomacy would exploit, and he does that brilliantly. And finally, on the 6th of February, 1778, the Americans and the British will sign a treaty of alliance. So Saratoga basically led directly to what the Brits feared the most, war with a major continental power, while still having to deal with the rebellion in America. So France enters the war in 1778. and they'll be followed by Spain in 1779. Now, Winston Churchill once said that the only thing worse than fighting with an ally is fighting without them, fighting without one. So having the French on our side really wasn't a cure-all, but they proved to be difficult allies. But still, they started with welcome naval support, and finally in 1780, the French landed an army in America. And this army would ultimately combine with Washington's and with a timely and critical assist by the French Navy in a campaign that ended in the final and decisive American victory at Yorktown in October of 1781. So quite simply, the Americans could never have had a Yorktown without a Saratoga. So the great American victory at Saratoga changed the entire character of the American Revolution. And although Saratoga is not sufficient, was not sufficient to guarantee American independence, it was necessary. So, okay, now that I've run through this very complex campaign at lightning speed, I like to zero in on two of my key interpretations. So although the book covers the entire campaign from start to finish, along with the lead up and the aftermath, there's two main threads that I really think kind of weave themselves throughout the book. The first is military strategy. Now, you know, strategy might be one of the most misunderstood and misused words in the English language. But basically, strategy is just the calculated application of ways and means to achieve a political objective. Sounds really simple, right? But it's really hard to get it right. If it was easy, we'd be a lot better at it. I give you Afghanistan. So strategy is really hard. So one of the most fascinating and confusing things, I think, and misunderstood things about the Saratoga campaign is how the British developed and executed their military strategy for 1777. So let's step back and take a look at how that played out. So these are the four men who would play the largest role in creating and executing British military strategy in 1777. So we've already met a few of these. So clockwise from the top middle, you've got King George III, who was heavily involved in strategy development and also making key personnel decisions. On the right there, you've got General Sir William Howe, Commander-in-Chief in North America, with his headquarters in New York City. Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, of course. He had been second in command of Canada, but in early 1777, he was back in London. And then on the left there is Lord George Germain. He's a former general. He's Secretary of State for the colonies. And so it was George Germain who was responsible for managing the war in America. So in early 1777, both Burgoyne and Howe offer up competing plans for ending the rebellion. Remember, this is after Trenton and Princeton. It'll ultimately be up to Germain to reconcile those two plans and to issue guidance that would give British arms the best chance for success. Now, because Burgoyne was in London, he's able to press his case directly to the king and Lord Germain in January of 1777. Remember, this is almost 7 months before Burgoyne captures Fort Ticonderoga. So this is Burgoyne's plan. Some of this will look familiar to you. Basically, three converging columns. The main body coming down from Canada, of course, that would end up being Burgoyne's, seize Ticonderoga, gain loyalist support, and reach Albany by the fall. A supporting force via Lake Ontario and the Mohawk River Valley, also then leading to Albany. And then finally, they would link up with Howe's army coming up the Hudson River from New York City. The idea was to split the more rebellious New England colonies, use my mouse here, the more rebellious New England colonies from the rest of America by gaining control of the Hudson River Valley and the Hudson Highlands, and then conduct further unspecified operations into New England. So on paper, it's imaginative, but it's extremely complex plan. In reality, I think, really, it'd be difficult to pull off today, let alone in the late 18th century, because of distance, time, weather, logistical challenges over very, very tough, unforgiving, sometimes wilderness terrain. But it was enthusiastically embraced by both the king and Lord Germain. But Howe, the British commander-in-chief, had his own ideas on how to win the war in 1777. Now, Howe's plan was to seize Philadelphia, the sort of nominal American capital, because that's where Congress is. And in the process, he hoped that this would lure Washington into a battle in which Howe could destroy the main American army and thus win the war. He thought that because by early 1777, Howe realized that George Washington and the main American army was the true center of gravity of the rebellion. So when Howe first presented this plan, Germain assumed he'd just march overland from New York City to Philadelphia. But Howe really didn't want to do that because he thought his lines of communications would be vulnerable to American attack. And so he decided to use the Royal Navy instead, which was commanded by his brother in American waters, to transport his army by sea. Now, there's lots of good things about going by sea, but as it turned out, speed was not one of them, mainly because of contrary winds. But at any rate, once he threatened to seize Philadelphia, Howe assumed George Washington would be forced to defend it, and thus he could have his big decisive battle. So these are the two competing plans, and the huge challenge for the British was to either pick one of these two options and go with it, or somehow coordinate the two into one coherent military strategy for 1777. Now, there are all sorts of problems with reconciling those two competing plans, but one of the biggest is the distance. So here you've got a situation where you've got one key decision maker, the commander-in-chief, who's Sir William Howe, sitting there in New York City, and the rest of the key decision makers, the King, Germain, and Burgoyne, are sitting there in London. Now, there's 3,000 miles in between. Today, it wouldn't be a big deal. But back then, of course, it took a long time to get a message back and forth. And if you're going to try to exchange messages, send a message to across the Atlantic and then get a reply, that could take up to 3 months. As you might imagine, that's going to cause problems with trying to reconcile this plan, or these plans. So as I mentioned, it was up to Lord George Germain, Secretary of the State for Colonies, to reconcile these two proposals. As you might expect, because of that distance issue, orders will end up crossing. It will lead to misunderstandings, all sorts of pain and confusion, as you might expect. What ends up happening is Germain will approve Burgoyne's plan, but he'll also approve Howe's plan. But he tells Howe, once you finish in Philadelphia, then you go up to Albany and support Burgoyne. But Howe doesn't really receive clear instructions to assist Burgoyne until he's already at sea heading for Philadelphia. By that time, it gets too late. So it's all very confusing. In my book, I have this detailed appendix where I trace all the letters and orders that went back and forth between all these decision makers, when it was sent, when it was received, the subject of the letter or report or whatever. So you can kind of trace the breadcrumbs on how this strategy fell apart. So with the King's and Germain's approval in his pocket, Burgoyne will set sail from England. He arrives in Quebec in early May to prepare his army to invade New York via Lake Champlain. At the same time, Howe, who, remember, he's the commander-in-chief, had also received orders from Germain and the King approving his plan to go to Philadelphia, with just a suggestion that he should support Burgoyne once he finished at Philadelphia. So you can see why there's a problem. There's no overall, who's in charge? There's no overall strategy. What ends up happening, there basically ends up being two competing strategies, and in some ways they're almost working at cross purposes. And one of the big arguments of the book, and I'll be interested to see once you read it if you agree with me, is that everything that happens in this campaign will flow from this faulty strategy. So that's one of the two interpretations, or my key arguments. The second, that was the first one. The second one is leadership and personalities. I really enjoyed doing both of these. So frankly, the vast majority of leaders on both sides at the colonel level and below were very good. The main difference between the two sides' leadership, I think, and I argue, was at the senior leader level, both military and civilian. Now, senior level leadership requires much different skills than those at the lower level. So I flesh out these personalities and I examine the leadership of these senior leaders on both sides at some length. Now, here are just a few of the British senior leaders that played major roles in the campaign. We've talked about all of these guys so far. They should all look familiar to you. The only one we haven't is the guy in the middle bottom row. He is General Sir Guy Carleton. He's the commander-in-chief in Canada. So General Sir William Howe, he's commander-in-chief in North America minus Canada. General Sir Guy Carleton is commander-in-chief in Canada. So all of them are playing major roles. There's many others. There's Brigadier General Barry St. Leger, Brigadier General Simon Fraser, outstanding combat commander, Major General William Phillips, who was Burgoyne's nominal second in command, Major General Friedrich Riedesel, who commands the German troops, German Allied troops who are with Burgoyne, and another very, very interesting guy, the Mohawk chief, brilliant leader, Joseph Grant. So what am I talking about when I talk about these senior leaders? They have, the leadership at the lower level requires different skills than the upper level. Upper level, a commander has to think much differently. He or she has to use critical thinking, creative thinking, systems thinking, problem management, dealing with competing interests, prioritizing, dealing with change, consensus building, negotiations, dealing with his or her subordinates, team building, communications, both internal and external. Very different skills than, say, a captain or a colonel regimental commander has to deal with. So those are some of the British cast of characters. Here are some of the Americans. Again, we've met some of these. Clockwise from top left, of course, you've got Major General Philip Schuyler, George Washington, the American Commander-in-Chief, Horatio Gates. Lower right there, you've got Colonel Peter Gansevoort. I threw the colonel in there because he was commander at Fort Stanwix. And of course, General Arthur Sinclair, commanding at Fort Ticonderoga. And on the far left, we've talked about him, but we haven't shown a picture of him. On the bottom left, Major General Benedict Arnold, who plays such a huge role in this campaign. Other Americans who I talk about at some length and kind of flesh out their personalities and their leadership, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who will ultimately become Gates' second in command, Brigadier General John Stark, the victor at Bennington, Colonel Daniel Morgan. Again, I mention him because even though he's a colonel, he played a huge role in both battles of Saratoga. Lieutenant Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the brilliant Polish engineer, and Colonel James Wilkinson, who was basically acted as the key staff officer for both Schuyler and Gates. So these are just some of those key leaders. Now, as part of my assessment of these different leaders, I compare the performance of the two opposing commanders-in-chief, the American Washington and the British Howe. Both were essentially had two roles. They were commanders-in-chief of their respective forces, but also they acted as army commanders. So they basically had those two responsibilities, but their respective performances were really quite different. Washington has this strategic sense that I think was lost on the British commanders. This is, I think, one of the things that makes my book a little bit different. I spend a lot of time talking about Washington as commander-in-chief. In other words, he sees the entire theater of operations as a whole. This Howe didn't do. Washington knew that operations in the North would affect his operations and vice versa. And as the commander-in-chief, he had to try to coordinate the overall strategy as best he could. And this, again, Howe just didn't do. In the summer of 1777, most of his attention was focused on trying to figure out what Howe and the main British Army was trying to do. But through all that, he also had his eye on what was going on 300 miles to the north. And after the stunning loss of Fort Ticonderoga, he supported the panicky Major General Schuyler with wise counsel, advice, support, and with reinforcements that Schuyler desperately needed. But the most important help Washington provided was sending experienced leaders. He sends Major General Benedict Arnold, his most aggressive combat commander. He sends Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who had a great influence on New England militia. He was a real popular guy amongst the militia, which was really important since Schuyler was not. He sends other general officers, General Nixon, Glover. He sends his most elite force, Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen from the main army. He sends them up to join the Northern Army. Now that's hard to do. Just think, you're sending your most elite force. Think the 18th century equivalent of the Delta Force of the Navy SEALs. Kind of a low density, high demand. Everybody wants them, but there's only one of them. And he sends other reinforcements as well. So Washington's performance as commander-in-chief is really in stark contrast to Howe's performance. Howe acts as an army commander, to be sure, but not as a true commander-in-chief. So there you have it. 40 minutes. We raced through. The Saratoga campaign, I think, was one of the most fascinating, multifaceted, consequential commands in American history. Few other commands have had as many far-reaching consequences, and it was the military campaign that guaranteed American independence, at least guaranteed it in the end. It was, as one American general wrote, it was the complete victory. So thank you, and I really look forward to your questions.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks. That was great. We do have a couple of questions from alumni that have been coming in.
Okay.
First was, he said, I understand that recent documents from George III indicate he played a larger role in strategy than previously understood. Do you know if that is the case?
Well, I mean, I think he played quite a major role, and I talk about that in the book. I haven't had a chance. I think you're referring to Andrew Roberts' new biography of George III. I'm really looking. I know Andrew is a great historian. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I haven't had a chance to do that yet. But if he's arguing that George III had a greater role in strategy development, I think he's right. Both in 1777 and in 1778. I've got an entire chapter on the book on the British reaction to Saratoga. And how they tried to really kind of assess their military strategy after Saratoga and trying to figure out what to do next. And George III is definitely involved. He's got his fingers in the strategy in both 1777 and 1778 for sure. So yes, I agree with that interpretation.
So the next question was, would the battle have had the same impact if Fort Ticonderoga had held out, delaying Burgoyne's southerly movement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've asked myself that. That's a fantastic counterfactual. You hear a lot of historians going, "Oh, I don't like counterfactuals." I actually love counterfactuals, and this is one I've kind of thought through. I'm not sure how it would have turned out. And one way, it may have actually turned out to Burgoyne's advantage because his supply lines were then much shorter back to Canada. He may have been able to then conduct an effective siege. He may have been able to prevent American reinforcements to getting to the fort. So that's hard to say, but I think personally, I think more likely is if the Americans would have held out, they would have been able to bring in more reinforcements. I think those militia forces that end up showing up at Bemis Heights in September and October of 1777 would have shown up earlier, and you would have had it would have been hard for Burgoyne to continue penetrating south. So the campaign then may have kind of just fizzled out up there near Ticonderoga, as their previous attempt to seize Ticonderoga in 1776 in the late fall of 1776 turned out. So again, it's hard to say. With Schuyler, though, as the general in charge of the Northern Army and the Northern Department, he really had a hard time dealing with militia. He wasn't popular at all. He wasn't popular amongst the other governors in the area, especially the New England governors. He certainly wasn't popular amongst the New England militia. So if he had stayed in command, then you may have not have had the big militia turnout. So there's several different ways I think it could go. But that's a fascinating counterfactual. I've tried to think through some of the possibilities on that.
Great. So this question actually came from a couple of different people, but did the American side have support from indigenous people in the area?
That's a terrific question. The primary Native American peoples came from the Six Nations, of course, the Six Nations, the Iroquois nations. And of all of those tribes, by the time you get to the Saratoga campaign, you know, the Americans and the British are working very hard to get all those tribes to come over on their respective sides. All these commanders that were assigned to the Northern Department, and even Washington himself, are trying to negotiate with these Native American leaders, trying to get them either to come in on the American side or at least be neutral. By the time Saratoga kicks off and really gets going, the vast majority, 4 of those Iroquois nations end up allying with the Brits. But 2, the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras, ally with the Americans. So there's a very small contingent of Oneida Native Americans with the Americans at Saratoga. There's a larger contingent of Oneida Native Americans with the American forces in the Mohawk River Valley. So they play a huge role in the Battle of Oriskany, and they also play an important role, even though they're very small, with the Americans at Ticonderoga, because they do a good job sort of countering what Native Americans that Burgoyne has left by the time he gets to Saratoga. So yes, they're very small in number, but they play an important role. Oh, I'm sorry. Just one add-on. The main reason that most historians, this isn't my work, I build on other great historians' work. The reason the Oneidas in particular allied with the Americans is thought that the main reason why is they had mainly become Christianized, and so they ally with the Americans.
So I'm going to actually combine 2 questions. They're both about the rifles that were used. The first is, they heard that a lot of the muskets at Saratoga came from French shipments, and just wanting to know if that was true. And then the second question was that they heard that the rifles were not very accurate from a distance, and how did that impact military strategy on both sides? Yeah,
for sure the Americans are armed with, actually the Americans are armed with kind of a hodgepodge of weapons, but yes, most of the Continental forces are armed with French weapons that have been smuggled through. There really isn't much of a British blockade at this point. That becomes more effective a little bit later on, but they're smuggled into America and are used to arm the Americans. Of course, Americans also, they're very resourceful. They're picking up any captured weapons and they're using British weapons as well, and so forth. The rifles are, fairly accurate. I mean, they're not accurate out to 600 yards. I mean, you read some silly things, but they're certainly much more accurate than the standard smoothbore musket that most of the soldiers on both sides are armed with. So they can be effective in hitting, say officers, key NCOs from a distance. And the Americans, the American force under Colonel Daniel Morgan, his riflemen, they're very good at that. And that's one of the reasons why Gates will send them out to really start both battles, the Battle of Freeman's Farm on the 19th of September and the Battle of Bemis Heights on the 7th of October. They're his elite force. He's going to send them out first, and they do a lot of damage to the Brits. I mean, they kill, mortally wound, Simon Fraser, who again I mentioned, he's probably Burgoyne's best combat commander. They kill him and other key officers as well. So they're very effective. Now Gates is he's smart. He knows that one of the big drawbacks to rifles at the time was they were very laborious to load. It took a long time for them to load. So your rate of fire is very low. So obviously when a rifleman is loading his weapon, in the process of loading his weapon, he's very vulnerable. And so what Gates did, as soon as Morgan shows up to join the Northern Army, he creates this ad hoc, hand-picked force of light infantry that will work directly. Which is commanded by a major, later Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dearborn of Dearborn, Michigan fame. And he will, Dearborn's light infantry will work hand in glove with Morgan's riflemen. And they really create some synergy, and they do really, really good work in both battles.
So the next question is, do you think that American success in the Saratoga campaign impacted debates during the Second Continental Congress to create the Articles of Confederation?
Yeah, I can't answer that. I mean, that's something I really didn't look into. So I'd just be speculating at this point. So yeah. I don't want to make something up there as I go along.
Sure.
Great question, though. I just don't know. Certainly the Saratoga campaign impacted, the political scene as well, obviously in America. You've all probably, I'm sure this audience is so well read on Hudson Valley history and all the revolutionary history. I'm sure you know about the Conway Cabal, the so-called Conway Cabal, the attempt to maybe replace Washington with Gates after Saratoga. That all had obviously all sorts of political intrigue involved. So it had some far-reaching impacts, not just military and not just diplomatic. And I do talk a lot about that in the book, but I don't really touch on the Articles of Confederation.
Gotcha. So this next question is much more vague. What are your thoughts on Lafayette, and do you think he was a strategic thinker?
I'm no expert on Lafayette at all. I just know that he certainly was a guy that Washington trusted, and I've always really been impressed with Washington. And after researching and writing this book, he's even higher on my hierarchy of American general officers. And so, to me, if Washington had high regard for Lafayette, I have high regard for Lafayette. And again, Lafayette comes into the story a little bit later. I don't really deal with Lafayette, and again, I wouldn't. I'm no expert on Lafayette, so I wouldn't hesitate to, or I wouldn't, jump out on a limb on that one. But I think Lafayette's a pretty impressive guy. I mean, he certainly, for being, his tender age, he certainly learns a lot. And by the Yorktown campaign, of course, he's performing quite well.
Okay, so I don't know if you'll know the answer to this one, but do you know why the British sent the forces up the St. Lawrence to Oswego and the Mohawk Valley to get to Albany instead of the much shorter route via Lake Champlain?
Well, the whole idea of that force was it's from the writings, it's not as clear as you might think, but they're either a supporting force or a diversionary force. So the idea was to send them on that circuitous route down the Mohawk River Valley. It would force the Americans to send major forces up the Mohawk River to face them. And that, of course, would make them weaker and make it easier for Burgoyne to go down to get down to Albany. And then, of course, as the primary plan called for, to link up with Howe. So it was all to pull off American forces, pull American forces away from that Lake Champlain, Hudson River corridor, get them away, make them deal with St. Leger and his force, so Burgoyne would have an easier time getting down to Albany. And then it was thought that, ultimately, of course, those Americans would probably have to come back, that would allow St. Leger to ultimately link up with Burgoyne. But that was the idea, to basically give Burgoyne a better chance to get to Albany. And one thing I didn't mention, Burgoyne, he really has absolutely no doubt that he's going to get to Albany. He is absolutely confident it's not going to be a problem, even when he finds out early in the campaign that Howe has gone to Philadelphia and he's not coming up the Hudson River. He's totally unconcerned. It's only after the Battle of Bennington, when he loses those 1,000 men and he's starting to have all these logistical problems, that he starts to worry at that point.
So the next question is about Benedict Arnold, and it's a two-parter again. First, did he get credit for the lifting of the siege at Fort Stanwix, or was this overlooked because of the battles at Saratoga? And then overall, do you think history has mistreated Benedict Arnold's legacy?
Okay, so the first part of the question, should he get credit for lifting the siege at Stanwix? I think he should get partial credit for that. I think anybody taking a force up the river. Now, he does some clever things with getting, some kind of information warfare, getting St. Leger to think that a much larger force is coming up the river than what Arnold actually had. But and so, yes, I mean, Arnold does really a great job throughout the entire campaign, and that's just one of them. So yes, he should receive partial credit. I give the vast bulk of the credit to Colonel Peter Gansevoort, the fort's commander. He really, really does a brilliant job. I'm not going to outline all the things he does. I want you to read the book because it's such an inspiring story. He does such a brilliant job. He's got a wonderful second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Moranius Willett, who also does a great job. They just do a tremendous job. And in fact, when Arnold arrives at Stanwix, of course, St. Leger has already left. One of the first things he does, he writes back to his boss saying, what a brilliant job that Gansevoort and Willett did defending that fort. So I give the lion's share of credit to those two men, Gansevoort and Willett, with an assist by General Arnold. Has history treated him about right? I think they have. I mean, historians have recognized his brilliant performance at Saratoga, and in fact, they, as I mentioned, I think they've gotten the story a little bit wrong. But the key piece of that, Arnold being brilliant, personally leading that final attack into that German fortified camp. I think they've got it right. I mean, we've got a good assessment of him. And then, of course, he became a traitor afterwards. I think part of the reason why historians have gotten that right is because they've gotten the piece about Gates wrong. The whole piece about Gates is, Gates doesn't deserve to, it was Arnold's victory at Saratoga. It wasn't Gates. No, I think that's wrong. I think Gates is the proper victor of Saratoga. Am I a Gates fan? Absolutely not. I'm not a Gates fan. But I think what a lot of historians have done is they've been tainted by Gates's performance after Saratoga, his attempt to kind of overturn Washington, his horrible performance at the Battle of Camden later in the war. And so that's tainted their assessment of Gates at Saratoga. I think Gates does a solid job at Saratoga, and he deserves to be called the victor of Saratoga, with an important assist by Arnold, but also by Morgan, also by Stark, also by Benjamin Lincoln, who's kind of the unsung guy, also by Schuyler, who helped set the conditions for American success at Saratoga. So it's a long-winded answer to yes. I think we've got Arnold about right, with the exception, I think, of getting the whole story about Saratoga a little bit wrong.
That's fair. So just to wrap it up, someone wanted to know if you're currently researching or planning on writing another book. And if so, on what?
Yes, it's funny. When I was Professor Johnson's student as a cadet, he got me really interested in American Civil War history. And I really later on became a Civil War historian. I mean, that's primarily what I did. I was a Civil War historian, but also you can't be a cadet at West Point. You can't teach at West Point without becoming interested in the American Revolution. So I've always been interested in the American Revolution. That was a minor field when I got my Ph.D. So I really became interested in the American Revolution. I wrote this book, obviously. And in writing this book, I really enjoyed the part about strategy and leadership. And I really became interested in Washington. Now, there's been so many things written about Washington, but what I'm thinking of writing about is a book about Washington's growth as commander-in-chief as the war progressed, and how he dealt with his relationships with his other senior leaders, and also, of course, Congress as the war progressed. So that's what I'm thinking about writing.
Awesome.
So
Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, of course. I'm going to pass it back to Tom, who I think is going to wrap this up. But thank you so much for all of your time and for answering so many questions.
It was a pleasure. Great questions, folks.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. And thank you very much, Kevin. That was an excellent lecture, lively. I would even say it was exciting. It was a very, very good job. I also want to thank all the guests for attending this virtual 2022 Cunneen-Hackett Lecture in Hudson River Valley History. Just a reminder that the spring issue of the Hudson River Valley Review will be arriving soon. This is the fall issue. I don't have the cover on the spring, but in the next few weeks, you'll be receiving, if you're subscribed, the Hudson River Valley Review. And if you have somehow not subscribed, www.hudsonrivervalley.org would allow you to do so. And also remember the Johnson Student Research Fund, as is listed in the chat, hudsonrivervalley.org/Johnson Student Fund. And I want to close off this lecture really with very, very special thanks for Jim Johnson for all that he has done for the Hudson River Valley, its history, its culture, its people. There is no greater proponent for the Hudson Valley and its history than Dr. James Johnson, Colonel Johnson.
Thank you.
I think on that note, Amanda, do you want to?
Yeah, no, thank you all very much for coming. We did record this, so if it's something you want to reference later, or if you have friends or colleagues who are interested, we'll have that up on YouTube tomorrow afternoon, and we will send you all a link to that. So thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.